She was given an impossible aircraft to fix just as an excuse to fire her. A senior engineer laughed. If she touches it, that $1 million jet's going straight to the scrapyard. The hangar chief growled, "If the engine doesn't start in 30 minutes, pack your tools and leave." Her co-workers began live streaming, waiting for the show. Let's see the crash and burn circus. No one imagined that in just half an hour, that very jet would rise into the sky while the whole hangar stared up in stunned silence. Hey, before we get into what happened, can you do me a quick favor? Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. It keeps stories like this one alive. Stories about people who get counted out but keep going anyway. It's a small thing, but it means everything to share this with you. All right, let's dive into her world. Linda Turner stood in the middle of the hangar, 28 years old, her faded work jumpsuit hanging loose on her slight frame. Her hair was pulled back in a low bun, a few strands sticking to her neck from the heat. Her hands smudged with engine grease rested by her sides, fingers twitching slightly like they were already reaching for a tool. She didn't look at the men snickering around her, didn't flinch at the weight of their stares. Her eyes were fixed on the VIP private jet, its silver body gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, a puzzle nobody else could crack. The engine had failed, a rare, stubborn glitch that had every mechanic in the place stumped. Tools clinked on workbenches. Radios crackled with static. But Linda stood still, her breath slow, like she was listening to the plane itself. The air was thick with tension, the kind that builds when someone's about to be humiliated. And everyone knew it was her. The hangar was a beast of a place, all concrete and steel, stretching out like a cathedral for machines. The smell of fuel and sweat hung heavy, mixing with the faint hum of generators. It was a man's world. Veteran engineers, ex-military types. Guys who'd spent decades wrenching on commercial jets and private planes for the ultra-rich. Linda didn't fit. She was young a woman and too plain for a place that thrived on flash. No makeup, no tight clothes, just that jumpsuit and a pair of scuffed steel-toe boots. She worked the late shifts, cleaned parts, ran diagnostics nobody else wanted. When she spoke, which wasn't often, her voice was soft but clear, like she'd thought through every word. People didn't listen. They saw the grease on her hands, the quiet of her face, and wrote her off. Invisible. Useless. That's what they thought. But Linda wasn't invisible now. The hangar chief Carl, a broad-shouldered man with a scowl that could curdle milk, pointed at her from across the room. "Linda, go try fixing this one. And if you screw it up, you're fired." His voice carried loud enough to turn every head. A few guys smirked. One coughed to hide a laugh. Carl didn't even look at her as he walked away, pulling out his phone like he'd just solved a problem. The jet was a lost cause, everyone knew it. Giving it to Linda was like handing a kid a broken watch and expecting it to tick. It was a setup, plain and simple. The kind of thing that happens when someone's already been judged and found wanting. The team didn't hold back. Mike, a senior engineer, lean and gray-haired with a voice like gravel, leaned against a toolbox, his arms crossed. "Letting her touch it is the fastest way to scrap the aircraft," he said loud enough for her to hear. Tim, a younger guy with a slick haircut and a smartwatch that flashed every time he moved, chimed in. "If they want to get rid of her, this is the cleanest setup." A few others nodded, their eyes glinting with the thrill of a shared joke. Linda didn't react. She picked up a diagnostic tablet, her fingers moving over the screen with a quiet focus, and walked toward the jet. Her steps were steady, not rushed like she hadn't heard a word. But the room was watching, waiting for the moment she'd crash and burn. The humiliation didn't stop, it got uglier. Linda climbed a rolling ladder to reach the jet's engine compartment, her boots clanging on the metal steps. The team gathered closer, not to help but to watch the show. Mike's smirk grew sharper, his eyes narrowing. What's she even doing up there? Checking for dust. Tim pulled out his phone, thumbing open the hangar's internal network. "Yo, I'm streaming this. Countdown to disaster repair." A few guys laughed, crowding around to see the feed. Dave, a stocky mechanic with a habit of chewing gum too loud, muttered, "She's gonna break something expensive and we'll all be cleaning up her mess." The words weren't just mean, they were personal, like they'd been waiting to spit them out for months. Linda opened the engine panel, her hands steady as she traced the wiring with a small flashlight. She didn't look at the crowd, didn't acknowledge the phones pointed at her. But her jaw tightened just for a second when Mike called out, "Careful, sweetheart, that's not a dishwasher." The word sweetheart landed like a slap and the laughter rippled through the room. She kept working, pulling a precision probe from her pocket, a tool most of them hadn't touched in years. Ethan, a young tech barely 20, with a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles, stood nearby watching her closely. He was new, still figuring out the pecking order, and hadn't joined the mocking. "How'd you know where to start?" he asked, his voice low, almost lost in the noise. Linda glanced at him, her eyes calm but sharp. "You can tell something's wrong just by the engine tone," she said. Ethan blinked like she'd just handed him a piece of wisdom he didn't expect. The moment passed, but the cruelty didn't. Carl stormed back, his face redder than before, fresh off a call with the client. "Are you trying to destroy a multi-million-dollar jet?" he shouted, pointing at the open panel. "Who gave you permission to tear it apart?" Linda didn't look up. She was deep in the wiring now, her probe moving like she knew exactly what she was looking for. "Found a misaligned sensor," she said, her voice even like she was stating a fact. "It was installed wrong last time." Carl froze just for a second, his mouth half open. But his scowl came back fast. "You're not touching avionics. Step away. Now." Mike jumped in, his voice dripping with scorn. "She probably only knows how to change oil and wipe wings. Avionics. That's suicide." The crowd got louder, feeding off the tension. A few guys started fake-checking their watches like they were counting down to her failure. Dave leaned toward Tim's phone, grinning for the live stream. "Can't wait for the smoke show," he said, his voice carrying across the hangar. Ethan looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Linda and the others. He didn't say anything, but he stayed close, watching her hands move with a precision that didn't match the chaos around her. Linda didn't flinch. She pulled the central panel off, exposing the jet's flight control system. The room went quiet for a moment, not out of respect but shock. Nobody expected her to get that far. Then Tim laughed, breaking the silence. "She's gonna fry the whole system. Bet she doesn't even know what she's looking at." But Linda did know. She reached for a specialized tool, a microcalibrator most of the team avoided because it was finicky and old school. Her fingers moved fast, reorienting the sensor with a precision that made Ethan's eyes widen. She wasn't just fixing something, she was unraveling a mystery nobody else had touched. Then she plugged the diagnostic tablet into the system and started typing. Not just typing, coding. Line after line, her fingers flew over the screen, rewriting part of the flight control software from memory. Ethan leaned closer, whispering, "She just fixed a bug our electronics team couldn't crack in 2 days." His voice was soft, like he didn't want the others to hear. Mike did, though. He snorted. "Beginner's luck. She's still gonna crash it." The pressure kept building like a storm rolling in. Carl, pacing now, checked his watch. "Fine," he barked. "You have 30 minutes. If the engine doesn't start, you're done here." The words hit the room like a hammer. Everyone circled closer, their phones still out, the live stream buzzing with comments from other hangars. "She's only embarrassing herself now," Dave muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. A few guys nodded, their smirks back in place. Linda didn't look at them. She sealed the panel, wiped her hands on her jumpsuit, and climbed down the ladder. Her face was calm, but her eyes had a focus that made Ethan step back. She wasn't just working, she was in control. The hangar felt like the pressure cooker, now the air thick with heat, the smell of oil, and the weight of everyone's expectations. Linda walked to the cockpit, her boots echoing on the concrete. The team followed, not because they believed in her, but because they wanted to see the disaster up close. She slid into the co-pilot seat, her hands moving over the controls like she'd done it 1,000 times. Carl stood at the cockpit door, arms crossed, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. "You want to start it, or should I?" Linda asked, her voice steady, almost quiet. The question hung there, sharp and unexpected. Carl's jaw tightened. He leaned in and pressed the switch himself like he was daring her to fail. For a moment, nothing happened. The room held its breath. Then the engine hummed to life, a low, perfect rumble that filled the hangar. Every status light on the dashboard blinked green. The sound was clean, steady, like the jet was brand new. Carl's face went blank. Mike's smirk vanished. Tim's phone dipped, the live stream forgotten. Ethan let out a small whoa under his breath. Linda didn't react. She ran a final systems check, her fingers moving over the controls with the same calm precision. Then she looked at Carl. "Recommend a runway test," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Carl didn't argue. He nodded, almost like he didn't trust himself to speak. The VIP client arrived just then, a tall man in a tailored suit, his face tight with impatience. He'd been waiting in the lounge, probably getting updates from Carl's panicked calls. He glanced at the jet, then at Linda still in the co-pilot's seat. "This thing ready to fly?" he asked, his tone sharp. Carl hesitated, then nodded. "She says it's good." The client raised an eyebrow, looking at Linda's jumpsuit, her grease-stained hands. He said like he couldn't believe it. Linda didn't respond. She just adjusted a dial, her face unreadable. They rolled the jet out to the runway. The hangar team followed, a strange mix of curiosity and disbelief on their faces. Linda stayed in the co-pilot's seat next to a test pilot who looked as skeptical as the rest. The client stood on the tarmac, arms crossed, watching. Carl was there too, his scowl gone, replaced by something else, maybe fear, maybe respect. The jet's engines roared, a deep, powerful sound that drowned out the chatter. Then it moved, gliding down the runway, smooth and steady. The nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. And just like that, the impossible jet was in the air, soaring across the sky, a silver streak against the clouds. The hangar team stood frozen, their heads tilted back, watching it climb. Nobody spoke. Nobody laughed. Tim's phone was still in his hand, but the live stream was off. Mike stared at the sky, his arms limp at his sides. Dave looked away like he couldn't handle what he was seeing. Ethan was the only one smiling, a small, quiet grin like he'd known something the others didn't. The jet banked gently, then disappeared into the distance. On the ground, the silence was deafening. The client was the first to move. He walked over as Linda climbed out of the cockpit, her jumpsuit still smudged, her face still calm. He held out his hand. "You're the best engineer I've ever met," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Linda shook his hand, her grip firm but not showy. "Just doing my job," she said. The client laughed like he couldn't believe her humility. Carl stepped forward, his face red, but not from anger this time. "Linda," he said, his voice rough, "I was wrong. Your lead technician effective immediately." He said it in front of the whole hangar, his words carrying over the hum of distant engines. A few guys shifted uncomfortably, their eyes on the ground. Linda didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just nodded like it was no big deal. But when she turned to the younger staff, Ethan and a few others who hadn't joined the mocking, she paused. "Never underestimate someone just because they're quiet or plain," she said. Her voice was soft, but it hit hard. Ethan nodded, his eyes bright with something like admiration. The others didn't meet her gaze. Later that day, the internal livestream clips started disappearing. Tim deleted his first, then Dave, then the rest. Nobody said why. They didn't have to. The fallout came fast. Mike, the senior engineer who'd called her sweetheart, got called into Carl's office the next morning. He walked out an hour later, his toolbox in hand, his face pale. Fired. Not for the jet, but for a pattern of behavior Carl couldn't ignore anymore. Tim's livestream comments got screenshotted before he could delete them. They ended up on an aviation forum, shared by someone who'd been watching. By the end of the week, Tim's side gig as a hangar influencer was over. No more sponsorships, no more followers. Dave, the muttering mechanic, got quieter after that. He stopped joking, stopped leaning on toolboxes like he owned the place. A few weeks later, he asked Linda to train him on the microcalibrator. She didn't say no. But let's go back a bit to before all this to understand why this moment hit so hard. Linda wasn't always in that hangar. She grew up in a small town, the kind with one stoplight and a diner that never closed. Her dad was a mechanic, not for planes but for cars, working out of a garage behind their house. She'd sit on a stool as a kid watching him take apart engines, her small hands passing him tools. He'd hum while he worked old country songs and tell her machines talk Linda. "You just gotta listen." She listened. By 12, she was fixing lawnmowers. By 16, she was rebuilding carburetors. But her dad died when she was 18 and the garage closed. She kept his wrench in her toolbox, the handle worn smooth from his grip. It was with her now, tucked in her jumpsuit pocket, a quiet reminder of where she came from. That wrench wasn't the only thing she carried. Linda had a past that nobody in the hangar knew about. She'd gone to community college, studying engineering on a scholarship, staying up late with textbooks she could barely afford. She didn't party, didn't date, didn't have time. She worked 2 jobs, waitressing and fixing cars on weekends to pay for her mom's medical bills. Her mom had been sick for years, and Linda sent every spare dollar home. Nobody in the hangar knew that either. They saw her plain clothes, her quiet ways, and assumed she was nobody. But Linda had fought for every step she'd taken, and that fight was in her now, steadying her hands as she worked on the jet. Back in the hangar, the mocking wasn't just words, it was a wall built to keep her small. When Linda first started at the airport, she'd tried to fit in. She'd nod at the guys, offer a small smile, ask about their day. They'd ignored her or worse, laughed. One time, early on, Mike had seen her reading an avionics manual during lunch. "What's that, your bedtime story?" he'd said, and the table had erupted. She stopped bringing books after that. Stopped smiling too. She learned to keep her head down, to let her work speak. But it didn't. Not until now. The day of the jet repair wasn't the first time she'd been tested. A month earlier, Carl had given her a simple task, recalibrating a fuel pump on an older plane. It was a trick. The pump was faulty and the job was meant to fail. She'd fixed it in 2 hours working alone, and when Carl checked it, he'd just grunted and walked away. No praise, no apology. She didn't expect it. But Ethan, the new kid, had been there watching. He'd asked her later, "How'd you know it was the valve?" She'd shrugged. It sounded wrong. He'd looked at her like she was a magician. That was the first time anyone in the hangar had really seen her. Now with the jet's panel open, that moment with Ethan came back. He was still there, hovering, his eyes wide as she worked. The others didn't notice, but Ethan did. When she pulled out the microcalibrator, he whispered, "Where'd you learn that?" She didn't answer, not because she was rude, but because she was focused. Her hands moved like they were dancing, each motion deliberate, like she was solving a puzzle she'd seen before. The truth was, she had, not this exact jet, but machines like it. She'd spent nights in her dad's garage poring over manuals he'd borrowed from a friend who worked at an airstrip. She'd taught herself piece by piece because she wanted to understand, because she loved it. The hangar wasn't just a workplace, it was a battlefield. Every day Linda walked in knowing she'd be judged. Not for her work, but for her clothes, her voice, her existence. The guys didn't just mock her, they erased her. When she'd fixed that fuel pump, nobody mentioned it. When she'd stayed late to finish a diagnostic, nobody thanked her. She was a ghost until they needed someone to blame. That's why Carl's order to fix the jet wasn't just a job, it was a public execution. They wanted her gone, not because she was bad, but because she didn't fit their idea of who belonged. As Linda worked on the jet, something shifted. Not in the room, but in her. Her hands didn't shake, but her breathing changed slower, deeper, like she was settling into herself. She'd been here before, not in this hangar, but in moments where the world bet against her. When her mom's hospital bills came and she'd worked 16-hour days to cover them. When her college advisor told her she'd never make it in aerospace. When her dad's garage closed and she'd stood in the empty space holding his wrench, promising herself she'd keep going. Every time she'd found a way. And she would now. The crowd's noise faded as she focused. The sensor wasn't just misaligned, it was a symptom. Something deeper was wrong, and she could feel it like a faint vibration in her bones. She traced the wiring further past where most would stop and found a second issue, a corrupted line in the flight control code. It was subtle, the kind of thing that could slip through a dozen checks. She didn't hesitate. She opened the tablet, her fingers flying over the keys, rewriting the code line by line. It wasn't guesswork. It was memory instinct, years of teaching herself when nobody else would. Ethan's whisper broke through. "You learned that from a book." She glanced at him just for a second, and the corner of her mouth twitched, not a smile, but close. Books. And listening. He nodded like he understood, but he didn't, not really. Nobody did. Not yet. The others were still laughing, still streaming, still waiting for the explosion. But Linda was past them now, in a place where their voices couldn't reach. She was with the machine, and it was talking to her, just like her dad said it would. When Carl gave her the 30-minute deadline, it wasn't just a threat, it was a gauntlet. The hangar became a stage, and Linda was the unwilling star. The guys circled like vultures, their phones out, their comments sharper. "She's gonna blow it," Tim said, his voice loud for the stream. "This is better than TV." Dave chewed his gum harder, his eyes narrowed. "She's only embarrassing herself now." Even the older guys, the ones who usually stayed quiet, joined in muttering about kids these days and women in the wrong place. Linda didn't look at them. She sealed the panel, her hands steady, and climbed down the ladder. Her boots hit the concrete, and for a moment, the sound was the only thing in the room. The cockpit was her next move, and it felt like walking into a lion's den. The team followed their footsteps loud, their whispers sharper. She slid into the co-pilot's seat, her hands moving over the controls with a quiet certainty. Carl stood at the door, his arms crossed, his face a storm cloud. "You want to start it, or should I?" She asked, her voice calm, almost too calm. It wasn't a challenge, it was a fact. She knew it would work. Carl's eyes narrowed, but he leaned in and pressed the switch, his knuckles white like he was bracing for disaster. The silence before the engine started was unbearable. Every eye was on the dashboard, every breath held. Then the hum came low and perfect, filling the hangar like a heartbeat. The status lights blinked green one by one, a chorus of approval. Carl's face froze. Mike's smirk vanished. Tim's phone slipped in his hand, the stream forgotten. Ethan let out a quiet, "Holy!" before catching himself. Linda didn't move. She ran the systems check, her fingers dancing over the controls, confirming what she already knew. The jet was alive. She looked at Carl. "Runway test," she said, not asking, just stating. He nodded, his mouth tight like he didn't trust himself to speak. The client's arrival changed the air. He was tall, sharp-suited, with the kind of presence that made people stand straighter. He'd been waiting, probably fuming, while Carl scrambled to explain the delay. He looked at the jet, then at Linda, still in the cockpit. "This thing ready?" he asked, his voice clipped. Carl nodded. "She says it's good." The client's eyebrow arched, his eyes taking in Linda's jumpsuit, her greasy hands. "She," he said like it was a joke. Linda didn't blink. She adjusted a dial, her face a mask of focus, and let her work answer. Rolling the jet to the runway was like moving a mountain. The team followed a strange procession, their faces a mix of doubt and curiosity. Linda stayed in the co-pilot's seat next to a test pilot who kept glancing at her like she was an alien. The client stood on the tarmac, arms crossed, his impatience radiating. Carl was there too, his scowl gone, replaced by something unreadable. The engines roared a deep primal sound that drowned out the whispers. The jet moved, gliding down the runway, smooth as glass. The nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. And just like that, the impossible jet was in the sky, a silver arrow cutting through the clouds. The team stood frozen, heads back, watching it soar. Nobody spoke. Nobody laughed. Tim's phone was in his hand, but the stream was dead. Mike stared at the sky, his arms limp. Dave looked away, his gum still for once. Ethan was the only one smiling, a small, quiet grin like he'd known all along. The jet banked a graceful arc, then vanished into the distance. The silence on the ground was heavy, like the world had shifted and nobody knew how to stand in it. The client moved first. He walked over as Linda climbed out of the cockpit, her jumpsuit still smudged, her face still calm. He held out his hand. "You're the best engineer I've ever met," he said, his voice carrying across the tarmac. Linda shook his hand, her grip firm but not showy. "Just doing my job," she said. The client laughed like he couldn't believe her. Carl stepped forward, his face red but not from anger now. "Linda," he said, his voice rough, "I was wrong. Your lead technician starting now." He said it loud in front of everyone, his words echoing over the hum of the runway. Linda didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just nodded like it was nothing. But when she turned to the younger staff, Ethan and a few others who hadn't mocked her, she paused. "Never underestimate someone just because they're quiet or plain," she said. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the noise. Ethan nodded, his eyes bright with admiration. The others couldn't look at her. Later that day, the live stream clips started vanishing. Tim deleted his first, then Dave, then the rest. Nobody said why. They didn't need to. The consequences weren't loud, but they were real. Mike got called into Carl's office the next morning. He walked out an hour later, toolbox in hand, face pale. Fired not for the jet, but for a pattern Carl couldn't ignore anymore. Tim's livestream comments got screenshotted before he could erase them. They spread on an aviation forum shared by someone who'd been watching. By the end of the week, Tim's side hustle as a hangar influencer was done. No sponsors, no followers. Dave got quieter. He stopped joking, stopped acting like he owned the place. A few weeks later, he asked Linda to show him the micro-calibrator. She didn't say no. Linda didn't talk about it. Didn't need to. The hangar changed around her. Guys who'd ignored her started nodding when she passed. Ethan followed her like a shadow, asking about engine tones and sensor alignments. Even Carl, gruff as ever, started checking with her before big jobs. The jet's flight wasn't just a win, it was a shift. A toxic corner of the world got a little less cruel, a little more just... And Linda, still in her faded jumpsuit, kept working. Late shifts. Quiet focus. Grease on her hands. She didn't need their apologies. Didn't need their praise. She'd fix the impossible, not for them, but because it was right. Because she could. And when she walked out of the hangar that night, the sky was clear, the stars bright above the runway. She glanced up just for a moment and kept walking. Her steps were steady, her head high. Nobody laughed now. Nobody dared. For everyone who's ever been judged, overlooked, or told they didn't belong, you saw her. You felt that you weren't wrong to keep going. You're not alone in this. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.